Hi, I'm Alex Sudras, and welcome to our fourth Boldmethod Live IFR course. Sorry for the delay. We thought we'd do this a little bit airline style where nothing really leaves on time. But it's kind of fits with the holding pattern theme. Everything might be a bit delayed. Tonight is kind of the first of two parts in holding patterns. Tonight we're going to talk about entries. And we're going to go through each of the three recommended entries. We're going to talk about wind correction, and we're going to talk about how to choose the right holding pattern entry. 2 weeks from now, we're going to go through timing and correction in the actual pattern. We're going to talk about how to adjust for wind on your turn, on your outbound leg, and then how to measure it on the inbound leg. And then next week, we'll also talk about some concerns like fuel burn and all the things that you really do need to think about when you're holding that you don't necessarily think a lot about during training. But first of all, if you're flying IFR today, chances are you've got an IFR approved GPS. And so one of the questions that we get oftentimes is how often do we actually fly a traditional holding pattern? And before we did the broadcast, I picked up a couple of my friends who work for airlines and asked some people who fly really actively in GA. And we all kind of came down with the same thing. In the real IFR world, the most common holding patterns that we get in light aircraft are typically the hold in lieu of procedure turn at the beginning of an approach. It almost always, the GPS navigates us through that, chooses our entry, flies a pattern, does a fantastic job. And in the real world, most of the time, we're going to let the GPS do that unless we want to practice. In the airline world, hold and lose of procedure turns, they're pretty rare. So most of their holding happens en route or possibly on a missed approach. And the same thing for most large transport category aircraft these days, especially airliners, there's a way to program the hold into the FMS. So, holding pattern entries are something we really don't do a lot, not manually. And that's actually part of the problem. When you're in training, you do them all the time. You allow the GPS to do an entry for you every once in a while, and you sit back and enjoy it because it's easy. But, in real life and on your check ride, you're going to have to manually determine the entry and fly the pattern. And so the problem is, in real world, the times you're going to need a manual holding pattern entry are typically when you don't have enough time to get it into your GPS or your flight management system, or if you're not GPS equipped, though that's becoming more and more rare. And that could be something like an alternate missed approach instruction. If you're not flying the published missed approach, then you're not able to fly the procedure as it's in the GPS database, and as you go missed, you're going to start navigating on your own. And you probably won't have time to program the hold in because you'll be pretty busy cleaning up and climbing on that missed approach procedure. Or if you get a holding instruction rapidly and you're not really familiar with your FMS or your GPS system and you're not really comfortable with entering that information, you may find yourself way too close to the fix and you don't have enough time to let automation or GPS help you out. So that's the thing. One of the problems flying today that we really didn't have 25 years ago is we've got a lot of things to help us. It makes flying much easier and much safer, but at the same time, it means that it's easy to lose proficiency in those basic skills, and when you need to use those basic skills, they're almost always unexpected, and usually you're using them because ATC is fairly busy, and they really need you to do this right. So even if you're flying the most automated airplane, feeling comfortable with manual holding pattern entries, it's a good thing. Are you going to use them a lot? No, but when you need to use them, they're fairly important. So as I said, we'll start by quickly doing an overview of the three kinds of entries, just looking at some pictures. And then we have examples of each in real-world IFR scenarios or real-world procedures. And we're going to walk through how to fly the entry without wind, and we're going to talk about how to fly it with wind. So let's jump to the iPad. Okay, this is a standard holding pattern. And if we've got some people who don't have an instrument rating yet or new to this, let's take a look at some basic items here on the holding pattern. This right here in the center is your holding fix. That's what the pattern is based off of. And really, a holding pattern only needs two things. It needs the fix and it needs a course. And that's it. A dot or a triangle with a line. And then from there, they'll give you turns, standard pattern, or right-hand turns, non-standard pattern, left-hand turns, and leg lengths, which, sorry, I drew it in the wrong place there, are only on the inbound leg, and that could be in timing, like 1 minute, or more commonly now with RNAV procedures in miles, like 4 nautical miles. But essentially, that's what defines a holding pattern. And the way we enter a holding pattern and join that kind of oval shape, that all just depends on where we're arriving from. And so what you can see is we've got this outline into a few different sectors. Right here, this large sector in the back that you see, this area right here, that is your direct entry. Then you've got a sector here. That sector is 120 degrees large, and it's your parallel entry. And then there's a smaller 70-degree sector, which is your teardrop entry. Okay, so before we get into each of those entries, the concept here is very, very simple. They're going to give you kind of a standard pattern to fly with one goal, two really. Number one, keep you in the protected side of the holding pattern, keep you in protected airspace. And number two, to allow you to get established on that inbound course to the holding fix. That's incredibly important. Your goal in the entry is to join that inbound course far enough out that you have time to determine your freeze heading. Because if you don't, you have no idea how to correct on your first turn in the holding pattern. So when people talk about, well, how long should the inbound leg be on my entry, or should it be a minute or 4 miles? There's no requirement. All of these entries are defined in the AIM. They're talked about in the Instrument Flying Handbook. They're recommendations. They're not required. And that first inbound leg after your entry, the length is totally up to you. There's no requirement for that to be a minute or 4 miles or whatever. The goal is to allow you to get established on the inbound course, determine your wind correction, and keep you on the protected side. So let's jump back. Let me clear this. When we talk about the protected side, what we're really saying is ATC protects a padding of airspace that kind of looks, like this. And what you notice is we call this side on top the protected side, but really they protect kind of a large area. And that protection is based off of the holding pattern's maximum airspeed, or if the holding pattern is based off of distance, by the distance in the holding pattern. And that's the interesting to think about. When you think about aircraft in a holding pattern, and typically when we're learning, we're like, okay, if it's over a minute, what's going to happen? The answer is ATC is not going to know, not in a Cessna, because they're typically protecting that pattern for aircraft that could be flying up to 200 knots or 230 or 265, depending on what altitude you're at. So, in a Cirrus or a Cessna, you are really within kind of the leg lengths, even if you're fudging it a little bit. And talking to controllers, oftentimes, they don't even know what the pattern looks like. They just know they're happy if you're staying next to that fix. Of course, as pilots, we're a lot more disciplined with the way we hold a pattern. And that's to make sure that we stay in that protected airspace. But, people ask, and I know one of the questions came in, how much of that other side is protected? And the answer is it depends on the speed range of the holding pattern, and it depends on the distance. And it's something that I don't know off the top of my head. But the FAA does know that as you're correcting, you could end up, a little bit of a deflection off away towards the non-protected side, and it's meant to handle that. But you're not meant to do an entry over there. And that's something we could take a look at and see if we can find those specific distances. But I always tell people, as a pilot, the most important thing is, fly that inbound course normally and keep yourself on the protected or the holding side of the pattern, the side that the holding pattern's on. Okay, so let's jump back to the iPad. And we're going to start by looking at each of these different procedures. So I'm going to pull up our next picture here. This is, I think, my favorite entry, the easiest entry, and it's the direct entry. The direct entry essentially allows the airplane to fly to the holding fix. And then you just turn and fly essentially a shortened version of the pattern. You're going to fly outbound, then bring the aircraft back around, join the inbound course, and hit the fix. And once you've made that turn, the entry is done, and you're now in the holding pattern. If you look at the arrival area, essentially you take the fix, and if you imagine a perpendicular line on the fix right here, you just kind of bend that back 20 degrees. And that gives you this line that divides the fix. This area is called the direct entry area. And if you draw some approach courses, it makes sense. this is a turn that would be practical. You could do this in the airplane. And that's one of the things. When you're trying to visualize how to enter a holding pattern, one of the questions I always say is, can you imagine where you're coming from? And can you look at the holding pattern? And if you can imagine those two, does this entry make sense? Does this look like a turn you'd be able to accomplish? And if we're operating in this area, you're arriving on this heading right here, it makes sense that we would just turn and join the holding pattern. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. This is a parallel entry. And the zone here takes that 7-degree line and then splits on that holding pattern course. So we're covering all arrivals in this sector. And this also makes sense. Now, you're not going to be able to turn and then join the outbound leg here. So the easiest entry is to fly to the fix, parallel it out, and then essentially take an intercept heading and join that inbound course and fly back to the holding fix. And the last type of entry is a teardrop entry. I think the direct's the easiest. I don't know. They all are fairly comfortable once you get to them. People tend to prefer teardrops, I think. GPS seems to always choose a teardrop. The procedure is very easy to fly. You're operating in this small area right here. So if you're arriving from this teardrop sector, you're flying to the fix. Once you hit the fix, it makes sense. The easiest thing to do is to fly this 30-degree course and then turn around. And we'll look at this in detail in a second, but essentially it's a 30-degree course, or roughly that. It'll change with wind, and you fly it generally for about 1 minute, and then you bring the aircraft back around. And it makes sense. The pattern makes sense. The angle of turn that you have to do to join this pattern is pretty small. So if you look at it, coming in from this sector, it would be a huge turn to do a teardrop. It's a small turn to do a direct. Coming in from the teardrop side, you could possibly make it parallel work, but that teardrop heading is basically right on your course. So with all of these, one of the things I always tell people is once you start to be able to imagine where you're from, where you're coming from and where you're going to, and you can draw out that holding pattern in your head, then choosing an entry is fairly simple. The problem is it takes a lot of experience to get really comfortable with that situational awareness and to be able to look at a pattern and to draw those lines mentally and say, okay, I'm coming from this sector. So if you watch that and you're like, okay, I'm going to struggle with which sector am I in, and how do I bend that back, and should I draw that on a chart? Don't feel like you're the only one, because that is really tough to do. So there's a way to do it that is much easier. And let's jump into our first example. So we're going to join a holding pattern here. Okay, right now we're on the ILS to runway 10, or joining the ILS to runway 10, and the initial approach fix is RevMe. And there's what we call a hold in lieu of procedure turn. So if you're not familiar with approaches, we need to get you lined up with the inbound course here at RevMe, and if we were to just pull you in line, you wouldn't have much room to descend and get established. So what the procedure designer is going to do is he's going to force you, or she will force you to make a turn in holding. A hold in lieu of procedure turn. And a procedure turn is just a way to turn around. What the designer's saying is, I'm just going to have you enter this pattern, fly the pattern once, just the entry, to line yourself up with the inbound course, and then you can shoot along into the airport. So what we need to do is just an entry. And if you look at this, let's start flying this in. A direct looks like it makes sense. But here's the easy way to tell. Okay, so now we've drawn those lines. You can see this direct zone, the blue zone, we're clearly in it. But visualizing that on a chart, that can be a little bit difficult. So on the right side, on our HSI, and this works with a heading indicator or an HSI, we're looking at the thumb rule. And the thumb rule, as I said, all you need is a working heading indicator or a rotatable card, like an ADF card if your heading indicator's out, and a thumb or a finger, which you hopefully have with you in the airplane. And it's a cheat that works in airline cockpits and GA. I've seen a million students use it on instrument check rides. I used to give instrument check rides a long time ago at UND back in the early 2000s. And it was one of my favorite things to see because it means I feel comfortable using a technique that works. The concept is you can use your thumb or a finger to basically draw the dividing line. And if you're doing a right hand turning holding pattern, we're going to use our right thumb. And if we're using a left hand turning holding pattern, we're going to use our left thumb. So that's the easy part. And then the second part is we're going to look for that holding course, not the inbound course, but the outbound radial, okay, or the holding radial. I'm very careful about not saying the outbound course of a holding pattern because you really don't. You have an outbound leg, but it doesn't follow a defined course. But basically kind of that outbound radial that defines the holding pattern. We just need our thumb and we need to know that. And that radial is going to be given to you by ATC if they're giving you a random hold, which is really rare, or it's going to be drawn on your chart. So let's jump back to the video and take a look. Our outbound radial on a Jepson chart is shown right here. The inbound course is 104. The outbound is 284. We're doing a right-hand pattern. You can see the turns depicted are right-hand turns. So we're going to use our right thumb. This is a jaundiced thumb, but it's as good as our graphic department could come up with on short notice. So the concept is you stick it right on top of the 90-degree line. I'm going to use red there so you can clearly see that. Right on top of the 90-degree point. Not centered on it, but right on top. And that gives you about a 20-degree zone right here. And remember we said on the chart that this tilts back 70 degrees. So your thumb is about 20 degrees wide. And that gets you really, really close. Okay, so when I put the thumb there, then you take a line from the top of your thumb and you just draw it through the center of the heading indicator down to the other side. Or if you don't need the thumb to visualize, it's basically 20 degrees to 20 degrees. That zone down here, that is your direct entry zone. So what we're looking for is to see that the holding outbound radial is in there. So we're going to look for 284 somewhere along our heading indicator here. And you're going to see 280, there's 284. That's where the radial would be. We're drawing this on an HSI, but you're not using the needle of the HSI. You're simply looking at that outbound radial, okay, the opposite of 104, which would be 284, and you're looking for that number on your heading arc. And if it's in this bottom zone right here, then it's a direct entry. There's a couple of other advantages to this. Holding pattern entries are based off headings and not off of courses. And that's because the point is to give you the easiest turn to join one of those entries. So it really doesn't make a difference what course you're arriving on. If you've got a really big wind correction angle, it's more the heading that you're currently flying. So the cool thing about using the thumb rule is that it takes into account wind because it's already showing up on your heading indicator. It makes it really, really easy. So let's watch this all the way through. We're going to watch and see what happens. And we're going to fly this in a standard no wind arrival into RevMe. So you can see we're on our way in. And as we approach RevMe, we're going to start our direct entry by turning in a no wind situation to the opposite of the inbound course. So that's listed right here, 284. This isn't a course because if you have wind, 284 is not going to work. But in a no wind scenario, we're going to turn to 284. And then when my wings roll level or I pass a beam the fix, we're going to start our time. So our goal on this is to give ourselves some room so that when we turn back around and join that inbound holding course, we have room to get established. We have time to pick a freeze heading and figure out our wind correction angle. And so typically we're going to use 1 minute. And people ask, if I'm flying a DME or a distance-based hold, should I fly outbound to 4 miles? It's really up to you. The entry is recommended. It's not the procedure is not required. The aim in the Instrument Procedures Handbook or Instrument Flying Handbook don't say anything about extending the entry beyond the standard 1 minute. If you're using a GPS to enter the hold, you'll notice it actually flies. If it's a distance-based hold, like an RNAV hold usually is, it's going to fly that full distance on the entry and bring you around. It does not do a 1 minute or a short turn. So on a standard 1 minute or a 1.5 minute hold, if you want to fly out 1.5 minutes to give yourself more room, go for it. Again, it's not quite the way the aim describes, but at the same time, it's a recommended entry. And you're allowed to do whatever you want as long as you stay on the holding side. And really, you're not changing the entry, you're just giving yourself some room. So why did I start my time when I rolled wings level? Let's take a look at that pattern again. Typically, in a normal holding pattern, we're going to start our outbound leg time when we're abeam the fix. But the problem with my entry here is I'm never going to be abeam the fix. Not on this turn. I'm turning in right away. I could start my time right as I cross the fix, but that 90-degree turn is going to take at least 30 seconds, and that's going to be a short turn. It could be significantly longer. You could have a minute. You could have a minute on a turn, or even further. So if your direct entry isn't going to take you out past the fix and then back around so that you can judge the beam point, I wait to start my minute until I'm wings level. Otherwise, that outbound section could be so short that you end up turning in to intercept the inbound course and you don't have any room. And if you do end up flying more of kind of a standard holding pattern on a direct entry, we'll go back to the iPad and look at it there. If you're kind of coming in from somewhere like here and you start the turn, I'll wait till I'm abeam the fix. And typically, you'll recognize this because you'll get a to from flag flip, or if you're using DME, RevMe is at 15 DME, you'll see that number. That's where I'll start the time, and I'll time my outbound leg. In a no-wind scenario, I'm going to fly for 1 minute. So I'm waiting for that to count out to 1 minute. And then at that point in time, I'm going to start my turn to intercept the inbound holding course. I'm doing a standard rate turn all the way until I join that inbound leg, and I'm going to roll level. And of course, because this is a theoretical no-wind situation, that should, if you do 2 standard rate turns, you should roll out pretty close to on the needle. Now, the reality is that doesn't happen, and we'll take a look at that in the wind example. The next question we typically get is, should I time this first leg? And the answer to that is no, there's no reason to, unless you're doing it just to stay consistent so that you remember to hit the timer. And the reason it doesn't matter is because during an entry, the entire pattern is a little bit out of whack. There's nothing that's standard about it, unless you enter right on the inbound course. It's about the only time. And so because of that, that time on the inbound leg, it's really not going to lead you to any good information. You're not going to use it for anything. So you can start the time when you roll wings level out of habit if you like. There's nothing wrong with that. And a lot of people find doing the same thing every time helps them prevent from forgetting. But you don't need to use that time for anything. I would use that first real turn in holding after the entry to gauge your inbound leg time. One of the other things that I know, and I'll say this really quickly about doing things kind of out of habit, is sometimes that can bleed into, what am I doing this for? And what do I use this for? So, that's kind of one of the things I always caution people on. If you're timing the inbound leg and you're not flying a near standard holding pattern on that first direct entry, make sure you remember it's not going to be very useful time. Okay, so let's go back to the iPad. And essentially, all we're trying to do here is track the inbound course to the fix and set up a freeze heading and a wind correction angle so that we can use it in our first actual turn and holding. So let's take a look at what happens when we add wind. So we're going to fly the same pattern. Today, the wind is out of 070 at 25 knots. So this is a fairly strong wind. You can imagine it coming maybe, right here. You could see the airplane is already crabbed into the wind as we're flying into RevMe. As we keep going inbound, we'll switch here in a second so that you can see those holding pattern entries. And there we go. Using the thumb rule, we're still able to see that the 284 holding radial, it's going to be right about here, is clearly in this bottom part of the heading indicator. And again, remember, we're taking a line that's basically 20 degrees above the 90-degree wing point. So we're resting our thumb right on that 90-degree wing point, and we're drawing a straight line mentally through the heading indicator all the way down to 20 degrees below. And if you wanted, you could even put your left thumb down here to kind of imagine that line. But you can see that outbound, or that, I shouldn't say outbound, that holding radial of 284 falls right there, clearly within the bottom half, which is the direct entry. Okay, so we'll continue flying this in. All right, fast forward it a little bit. And now you can see this doesn't look the same as the last direct entry. And the reason for that is we've got wind. The wind is coming from here. So if we tried to fly that standard entry, we'd start drifting out on this side of the pattern. When we made our turn inbound, we'd be somewhere over here. That's not going to work out very well. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to crab into the wind, towards the north, but into the wind, and fly a course, not just a crab angle that would kind of hold us here, but fly a course that actually takes us inside. Because what we're trying to do is a standard rate turn around a final. And we're doing that turn into a wind. So it's going to make it a really small turn as opposed to a large turn. So we need to use our course to get us in to that radial. So we're not just taking a wind correction angle, we're going to basically take a multiple of it. You know, if our wind correction angle, if we would say, well, normally with this wind, I think I might use 7 degrees, try 14 degrees, or try 3 times that, 21 degrees. Our goal is to get us a little bit in. You'll also know that this turn did not work out perfectly. And you'll see it here in a second. We're going to cross rev me. And in this case, I'm not starting my time yet, because if I did, I'd use up half of my 1 minute leg just basically making it onto the outbound heading. So I'm going to start it as I roll wings level on the entry. And the time starts. And once I get to a minute, I'm going to start my right turn to intercept that inbound holding course. And that wind's kind of making that turn really tight. You can see it doesn't work out quite right. So what I end up doing is holding a little bit of a wind correction angle to fly myself back onto the entry leg. And then from there, I'm going to pick that freeze heading and I'm going to fly it. You can see our freeze heading is right here. So it looks like it's about maybe, I don't know, I'd say 25, 23 degrees out. That's the wind correction angle that we need right now to fly this. And that's what's really important, knowing that number. We'll talk about this more in our next video, but the general rule you're going to use on your outbound leg is to triple your wind correction that you used flying inbound to the fix. And so the key thing I wanted you to see there is even on a holding pattern entry, you know, when you correct for the wind, that first turn is not going to be perfect. And if it is, it's usually just luck. You know, if you're going, okay, well, what's a computation I can use? You could probably design a computer system that would do it. Of course, GPS does it for you. But mentally, you really can't tell in an entry. You just have to use experience. You have to imagine where the wind's coming from, kind of guesstimate what a normal wind correction angle would be, try a little bit more than that to get yourself into the course, and then expect to get an intercept. But give yourself room to figure out that freeze heading on that inbound leg. Okay, we got a question.
Okay, I'm going to hop in here since we've seen one full entry. We've had this question come up a few times, which is why I want to hop in here. Spencer says that are you in the hold after you cross the fix for the first time, or do you have to cross the fix, do your full entry, cross the fix again, and then are you in the hold? When should you tell ATC?
You normally would tell ATC right as you cross the fix. The only reason you may not is if there is some reason where you feel like you cannot necessarily maintain that holding pattern. And so, you know, we use that establish for holding. Essentially, the entry is established. So I typically will report over my holding fix, as I cross it on the entry, that's when I'm established in the hold. And if you're on an instrument approach, it allows you to descend to an altitude in a holding pattern. That entry is considered part of the holding pattern. You're established in the pattern. You can start the descent now. If you're partial panel, if you've got an instrument failure, if you're not really quite sure that this hold is going to work out because of some malfunction on the airplane or something, you may, want to caution ATC or ask for assistance. But normally, that would be considered in the hold, and that's where you're going to give your report. Something to keep in mind with that, and we report as we cross for holding. Defined in the IFR system, this report is not often given, and you may feel like when you give it, the controller is like, huh, what? Oh, okay, thank you. Don't feel bad about that. We've had a lot of people ask us that. They're like, oh, I never hear people say it. And it's just something pilots forget because a lot of pilots don't hold very often. And so they forget to say it and people aren't used to saying it. If you feel like, wow, this was unexpected, it's just because it's an often forgotten part in the IFR system, but it's an important one to do because it allows the controller to know, okay, I've parked you there. And so I don't have to worry about you as much anymore. Okay, let's take a look at our next entry. And now let's see, we're going to do, I think this next one is a parallel. So let's pull that up. Let me clear the screen first. Okay, this parallel we're going to look at without wind. And if you look at the procedure here, this is your holding pattern. This is a left-hand turn, so a non-standard holding pattern. And we're coming in, it looks, just kind of looking at where you are on the map, like a parallel is going to make sense because you're going to fly out, outbound, in, and back. This procedure kind of makes sense. But the easy way to confirm and tell is to wait and to use your overlay. So we're going to pause it here. And if you look at this, this is a left-hand hold. It has left-hand turns. So we're using our left thumb and we're putting that right on top of the 90-degree wing point, drawing that line down. And then now we're using one of the top sections. So we're dividing it by the vertical line. This creates two different sections. The bigger one is the parallel section. The smaller one is a teardrop section. We're going to use, and what we're looking for is to see where our holding pattern radial is. So if we go back, this one's actually really easy to see. It's written right there, 226. So we're looking for a 226 on our heading indicator, and that's going to be right there. So if you imagine that holding radial, not the inbound course, but the opposite of it, that's squarely in the parallel entry zone. So let's quickly fly this out. You can see the pattern's already been drawn. We fly this a little bit non-standard, and I'll explain what we do here that's different, but I think it helps the pattern. First of all, we're going to cross the holding fix. And now, the recommendation is to fly outbound parallel to that. So when people talk about the protected area, you are slightly outside, into the area that you're away from the protected area. It's still protected airspace, but it's on the opposite side of the holding course. And then you're basically going to do a turn and pick an intercept. You'll notice that what we do is we re-intercept that and track outbound. That's not recommended, but it's not that they don't recommend it, it's not part of the recommendation, but it gives you a couple advantages. Number one, it prevents wind from blowing you far off of that holding course, which I have seen happen a lot, especially when you have high wind places. Grand Forks, the mountains in Colorado in the winter. You end up with a lot of wind. 50 knots of wind is standard. And so if that's parallel or perpendicular or holding course, it could easily blow you far away from that radial. So tracking that outbound helps you stay close to the holding pattern. The other thing that it does is it gives you an idea of what your inbound wind correction is going to be, because it's just going to be the exact opposite. So now you have twice the time to figure out your wind correction. That's why we re-intercept. It's not required, and if you do it, someone might mention, oh, it's not quite the way the AIM says it. It's not, but you're basically modifying it, and in this way, I think you're making it much easier for you to track that inbound course. So you can see we cross the fix. I'm going to start my time going on over there. I like to re-intercept the radial and fly that outbound. And once I hit 1 minute, we're going to bring the airplane back around, and I'm going to pick an intercept. The FAA doesn't recommend an intercept here. 45 degrees is what I like to fly in a no-wind scenario. I think we might have charted 30 on this. That one also works. But basically, an intercept that allows you to get established on the inbound holding course before you reach the fix and gives you enough time to set your wing correction angle. Okay, so let's watch this in wind. Okay, so you can see the wind in this case is coming out of, I'm going to rewind that just a second, 330 at 23. So it's coming out of here, and you know that because if you look at the airplane, it's crabbed slightly to the right, so you know the wind must be coming out of that direction. So as we move forward, let's take a look at that thumb rule. So we got our thumb on the top, draw our lines, left thumb because it's a left-hand turning pattern. The pattern is a 226 outbound, so we look at 220, 226, and we're squarely in the parallel entry zone. Okay, so let's keep playing this through. And you can see here with that wind out of 330, it's going to take us just a little bit longer to get reestablished on that outbound holding radial. But again, the advantage of tracking that is it prevents us from being blown somewhere outside of this holding course. Once I join back up, I'm looking to find my freeze heading, and I'm watching my clock. Remember, I started my time as I cross the fix, and I'm looking for 1 minute before I turn inbound. And then as I turn inbound, I'm thinking about what the wind is going to do to me. Okay, so if I feel like the wind is going to be pushing me further toward that fix, I'm going to pick a stronger intercept so that I don't get blown too far away. If I feel like it's going to push me in towards the course, I might take less of an intercept. And I'm essentially just adjusting my intercept so I have time to intercept the inbound radial before I reach the fix, but also that I don't blow through the course because my intercept is so great. Okay, let's take a look at the opposite, or the last entry here, and that's the teardrop. So I'm going to pause this here. And if we think about this, you look at the holding pattern, we're back to our right-hand pattern right here. This makes sense. Teardrop makes sense. You're going to fly outbound for a minute and turn around and come in. But the easiest way to confirm that is to use the thumb rule. So if we look, right-hand turns, right thumb, put it on top of the 90-degree point, draw your line down, you got your divisor here, and we're looking for 169. And if we look for the small segment is teardrop, I'm going to clear out those lines so you can clearly see. 150 is right here, so that's 160, 170. That puts 169 squarely in the teardrop area, the smallest of the groups. So we'll continue flying this in. And you can see our pattern. When we cross the fix, we're going to start our time, fly for a minute, and then make that turn inbound. So here we come to the fix. Timer starts, looking for a minute in a no-wind scenario. Once I hit there, I'm going to start my right turn around to intercept the inbound course, following a standard rate turn. And in a perfect no-wind world, that needle should basically roll right on up. And again, in this case, I'm not starting timing inbound because the leg, to me, it really has no timing meaning. But if you do it out of procedure, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, let's take a look at this with wind. Our wind is out of 125 at 21 knots. So coming from here. And it's fairly strong. You can see our ground speed's only 101 knots, but we've got an indicated airspeed, which we don't have written on here, or true airspeed really of 120. So it's going to slow us down. It's not much of a crab angle as we fly in, but it is going to slow us down on that outbound leg. And that means we're going to be kind of compacted in. So let's see what happens here. I'm going to fast forward it. If I was to fly a standard 1 minute leg, we'll wait till it crosses the fix. Okay, if I'm to fly a standard 1 minute leg here, what I'm going to find is that wind has blown me in and that leg is going to move forward to right here. So when I turn around to the inbound course, I really don't have a lot of room. So I'm going to add some fudge factor to it. And this is, again, something where people go, well, how much time should I add? Well, if you normally do a 1 minute entry and you have, let's say 20% of your speed, that you've got, 20% headwind. So if you're indicating 120 and you got roughly 25 knots of headwind component, I would say add another quarter on. So as opposed to 1 minute, fly 1 minute and 15 seconds. The key thing here is you're making an estimation. Again, without a complicated flight computer, you're not going to be able to figure this out in your head. This is an estimation, and your goal is to give yourself room. Especially when you're flying well below the maximum holding speed, it's better to give yourself a little more room than less. So, I'm giving myself some time in that headwind, and I'm going to fly the airplane out. So let's go back to the iPad. I'm going to fly to 1 minute and 15 seconds. You'll see that right here. And at 1 minute and 15, I'll start that right-hand turnaround to try to make the intercept. And as often happens in wind, you're going to see the airplane flew slightly through the course, which again is normal on a pattern entry. You're not going to be perfect. So you just simply take an intercept heading and then look for your freeze heading. And right now that looks like it's probably about 7 degrees. So I'd triple that on my outbound and I'd end up crabbing essentially 21 degrees into the wind this way. And we fly that into the fix. Okay, looks like we got a question, so let's jump into that.
Okay, and this is perfectly timed for what you just said, because Adam wants to know if you can explain the logic behind tripling the wind correction angle on the outbound leg. And I know this is getting a little ahead of ourselves with what we're doing next week, but I thought it was timely with what we're talking about right here.
The logic is it generally works. That's basically it. The problem is when you start to look at your turns and all of that, doing a simple calculation doesn't work because the headwind's affecting you in different ways as you make your turn inbound. So there really is no basic math that would give you an exact multiplier. But what you find is with tripling your outbound or tripling your inbound on your outbound leg, you're going to be close. You are not going to be perfect. It might be a little too much or it might be a little too little. But without using a flight computer that could do calculus and integrate your turns and all of that, which essentially your GPS is going to fly a perfect ground path, it's just a rule that gets you close. It's like the 60-to-1 rule, which is based off of basic geometry, but we kind of round it off. It's really 106 as opposed to 100. And so because of that, there's a little fudge factor in there. Well, the tripling the wind correction, it gets you very close, but it's not perfect. And it's just a rule that has evolved basically out of experience. And so when you look at that logic, the one thing that I will show is this. Let me go back to our initial holding pattern. So I'm going to jump into this picture right here. So this is a no wind holding pattern. But a with wind holding pattern is going to look completely different. And I'm going to draw that in red. You can see, let's see if I can make this a little thicker. So let's imagine we have wind coming out of the north. And we start at the fix. If we didn't do anything, the wind would kind of push us like this. And this would be our holding pattern, which obviously isn't going to work. If we just tried to take, let's say we figured out on our entry that our wind correction angle was 7 degrees, okay? So we turn around, we finish the turn, we think, well, I'll just take a 7-degree wind correction angle on the outbound and track it this way. That's not what happens. First of all, during the turn, the wind has pushed you in, so now you're in really, really tight. And yep, that repeating that wind correction is going to keep you perfectly parallel. But then remember that wind's coming out of the north, so as you make that turn, you're going to end up somewhere around down here. So that doesn't work. So the tripling concept is we cross, let's say we knew that it was 7 degrees. We make the turn, but now we fly out with a heading, a wind correction angle that basically takes us 21 degree wind correction angle. And you end up with something that looks like this. But now when you make that inbound turn and you've got all that tailwind in the turn, it gets you really close to that inbound course. That's something we're going to talk about in depth in a couple weeks, but that's the basic logic behind it. If you're trying to do a wing correction angle, that's the basic logic that follows behind it. Okay, I know there are a lot more questions on holding patterns. It's something that takes a lot of time to really understand. And so in 2 weeks, we're going to look at entries a little bit more. We're going to talk about setting courses and all of that, and we're going to look at wind correction in the actual pattern. So if you got any questions on holding patterns, there's a link in the comments to send them to us so we know what to include. I said it's something that's hard to cover all in one session. And then tomorrow night, we've got our pro kind of interview prep. And there's a link for that in the description as well. Tomorrow night, we're going to be talking about turbine engine and turbine aircraft cruise performance. If you're getting ready for an interview, maybe you're getting ready for a mainline interview where you know they're going to ask you some questions out of aerodynamics for naval aviators, or you never got an intro to turbine engines, but you're looking for a job at the airlines, we're going to talk about the basic characteristics of a turbine engine and the way it produces thrust and force, and how that translates into basic cruise speeds, your best endurance and your best range, and also how that plays into altitude, and essentially why high altitude operations in a jet can be hazardous because you have a really good chance of getting, not a good chance, but you're very close to your stall speed and your thrust limited. So we'll talk about why that happens. And that's all going to be tomorrow. The link is in the description. Thanks for joining us tonight, and I hope to see you tomorrow and in 2 weeks. Good night.